everyone. I'm Beth Loiseau, the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Affairs, and I'm really, am I supposed to be on the microphone?
That's
Sorry.
true, you are.
We are recording this for the benefit of your colleagues who are not here. So we have a little extra paraphernalia that I hope you will bear with us. I'm Beth Loiseau, the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Affairs, and welcome everybody for being here today. I want to welcome and introduce our guests, Donna Heiland and Laura Rosenthal, who are the editors, as you know, of Literary Study, Measurement, and the Sublime, and Disciplinary Assessment, which was published by the Teagle Foundation in 2011. And Donna, if you want to hold up the exhibit. We've got it right there. Downloadable, by the way, from the Teagle Foundation website. Full of an incredible variety of essays, many of them contentious and provocative. And these are essays that take the literary disciplines as a case study for a conversation about assessing what Donna and Laura call the sublime learning and creativity, and ask the questions, what is at stake in the work of assessment? What do we stand to gain? What do we fear to lose? And can current assessment methods capture the outcomes we might care most about, the complex, subtle, and seemingly ineffable heart of learning? And that is going to occupy a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Donna Heiland is Vice President and Special Assistant to the President at Emerson College. Before coming to Emerson in 2012, she served as Vice President of the Teagle Foundation, which is a granting organization dedicated to improving student learning and the liberal arts, and to participating in a national conversation about those topics. Prior to being at Teagle, she was the Director of Fellowship Programs at the American Council of Learned Societies, and perhaps even gave some of you fellowships. And she was Associate Professor of English at Vassar College, and one of her former students is actually here today. Donna is a scholar of 18th century English literature. She is the author of Gothic and Gender, an Introduction from 2004. She earned the PhD in English from Yale University and her BA from the University of Western Ontario. Laura Rosenthal is Professor of English at the University of Maryland College Park, where she chairs the Committee on Student Learning in the College of Arts and Humanities, which is the faculty group that is leading the discussion about fruitful program learning outcomes in the arts and humanities. She has also done some work with the Modern Language Association on the issue of the sort of presence of the disciplinary associations in the conversation about assessment. She, too, is a scholar of 18th century English literature. She's the author of Playwrights and Plagiarists in Early Modern England, Gender, Authorship, Literary Property, and of Infamous Commerce, Prostitution in 18th Century British Literature and Culture. I think Donna's got the kind of corner on the, with the plagiarists and the prostitutes. Sort of that side of the little bit beyond the law in 18th century. She's also the editor of Nightwalker's Prostitute Narratives from the 18th Century. And Donna earned her PhD from Northwestern University and her BA in English from Johns Hopkins. So with that, I welcome the two of them, and I will turn the morning over to Laura. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, good morning. It's great to see so many people here. I will tell you, just in case you want to ask me about this, the MLA project that Beth mentioned, for a lot of people here might be in MLA. I've been working the past 2 years on an MLA committee to come up with recommendations for outcomes assessment. And I have a few things from that committee here that we worked on, but it's really interesting. A lot of other professional organizations have been working on it. MLA has kind of been slow to take part in it, but it's been a really interesting committee. And if you remember, it should be coming up for a vote pretty soon. So, well, I don't know, maybe it just goes through the executive committee. But anyway, it's just specifically through the ADE, which is part of MLA. I guess the other thing I'd say by introduction is, just feel free to interrupt me and raise questions, ask for expansion. What I'm going to do this morning is is an overview of just, try to situate assessment in a larger context and some of the things you might not know about it that I think over the years I feel like people don't know enough about, and it's useful for them to know. So if it's all familiar, you can tell me, yeah, move on, we know this, blah, blah, blah. But if there's something that you want expanded on, I'm happy to do that. Happy to do that too. And there should be time for discussion at the end, but I welcome discussion as we go. So there we go. So I just want to start with what this is, and since a lot of you have already developed it, I think the straight, simple explanation is assessment is about figuring out what and how much students have learned. That's really just all there is to it. And I prefer to say figuring out rather than measuring, because measuring sort of creates a false atmosphere of something technical that involves a chart or some numbers, But really the heart of it is just figuring it out. And maybe a chart is your friend, but the chart is not the goal. The chart is the thing that helps you figure it out. So we also want to know what they haven't learned. Assessment is based on, so empirical data, but information, feedback, data also sounds sort of a little off-putting for arts and humanities people. I mean, for me, I've learned to say data, but really just information. So it tends to work best in aggregate. So this is another big misconception about assessment, that you don't usually assess the learning in an individual class unless it's a huge class and you're sort of working on something like that, or multiple sections taught across. But you really don't get, if you assess the learning in a classroom of 20 people, you really don't get that much information because there's so much kind of random input into that. So what you want to do is assess a whole program, like a history major. How much are history majors learning? And so this kind of takes us away from another really common faculty anxiety that, administrators are going to go around and try to figure out if your students are learning enough. Because what your students learn in your class is related to a lot of other factors, like what they come in with. And I mean, I've heard people say that really the best way to figure out if you've taught students well is actually how they do in the next class, not how they do in your class, because you've given them something and they're taking it on. So so that's harder to figure out. So it's really not about the greatness of the individual faculty member. It's really about kind of reorienting ourselves to more of a team vision, to kind of everybody together thinking about this. And it's very different from grading, and that's something I'll get to in later. So why do we assess? So there's basically two reasons why we're doing assessment. And one is the most immediate, pressing reason that probably nobody would be doing it without this reason, is that now it is needed for accreditation. And we have to be accredited. I mean, we're just out of business if we're not accredited. So, and this tends to be like the one thing, if people, fail accreditation or have to, go back to the beginning, this is sort of the major number one factor for people, not getting through accreditation these days is assessment. So historically, it's a compromise between those who wanted more direct governmental control over higher education and those who didn't want to do it at all. And so this is another kind of misconception that actually we've been talking about in the MLA committee, and I like to clear up, is that this is not government control over education. This is it's mediated by the accrediting agencies, and I'll talk about them in a minute. So in this sense, I know it gets confused with things like No Child Left Behind, but it's really very different. It's not kind of, and I'll talk about that more as we go. And it's also not standardized. The process, there are different regional accrediting agencies that have very different rules set up across the country, and then within your region, for most some regions are more directive than others, but within your region, there's, institutions are generally free to figure out how they want to put together their own assessment. So it's not particularly standardized. But I do want to mention that there's this whole other sort of history of assessment that has nothing to do with accreditation, which has to do with, people really trying to think about, very sort of progressive, liberal people trying to think of how can we have students learn more. And so it sort of, these two streams are oddly coming together now, but there is this history of people in education departments, psychology departments. I don't know, Donna, where else are they? Education and psychology, just trying to figure out like what leads to best learning. And this has been done. I mean, there's much more of it done at the K through 12 level, but there's been thought about this in higher education as well. Then, of course, as we know, we're also under increased pressure to explain the value of arts and humanities degree to the outside world. So assessment can be a way of explaining to people what our students are learning. It's also really good for starting conversations about learning within your program, and then, of course, improving those programs. So these are kind of two different agendas that are working side by side. I don't know, in the work I do with assessment, I tend not to think that much about the left side. I think you'll make yourself nuts if you think about that. I try to be on the positive side and think about this is a great opportunity to like really think about how students are learning and whether they're learning and how we can improve that and make everything better for them and for us. And that's the better. Oh, sure, yeah.
Last reaccreditation here, like do you do the whole university at once, or do you go school by school?
No, we do the whole university at once, and we just did this year our 5-year interim report.
Okay. Oh, sorry for Beth. Okay. The only reason I was asking is because I wasn't sure what, I don't need it because I'm already mic'd. I'll get this eventually. This is a minor comment. But NEASC, and I say this based on my experience at the Teagle Foundation, where I spent 8 years really working with colleges across the country on accreditation, on assessment projects. NEASC is great on this. I mean, I don't know how you're feeling about it, but very flexible, very open, very willing to let colleges and universities figure it out. And they stand out for me. I'm not sure what Middle States is like, but from what I know of the others, I think NEASC is among them the more flexible and open. The Northeast Association of Schools and Colleges.
NEASC is your regional accrediting agency.
Yeah. My apologies for that. And sorry, I just wanted to say, I think they're...
Middle States is my regional accrediting agency in Maryland, and they're actually great too. I mean, all they really say is, show evidence of student learning. And so that's all you have to do. And how you go about doing that is up to you. And so, so people worry, or I'm sorry, let me correct that. They don't want evidence of student learning. They want evidence that you are thinking about whether or not students are learning. So you do not present to them, this class of chemistry students like didn't know chemistry and now they do. They're not going to look at it in that, fine grain investigation. What they want to do is see if it's on your agenda, if it's part of how you operate, if you reflect every now and then about whether what you're doing is working. It's actually, I apologize for that mistake because that's a common confusion and I just made it myself. But they don't actually want evidence, the direct evidence of student learning. What they want is an evidence of you thinking about it and you investigating it.
Some do.
And I can add something here about our own accrediting agency, which is they just want to see a university-wide effort where faculty are engaged in taking a look at students and how students and then student learning as the result of programs. So we sit around as faculty and we say, okay, we want these courses are going to be the art history major. And they want evidence that there's some systematic way of sitting down and taking a look at whether what it is we think art history majors should have learned by the time they finish their art history degree at BU, that they actually have learned that. And however we figure that out is fine with them. They just want evidence of it.
Okay. So, all right. So this isn't like directly related to your assessment work, but I think it's really important to know. So I include a discussion of what accrediting agencies are and who they report to, because I think it's a big misconception. First of all, accreditors are member-funded organizations, and they're not governmental organizations. So really, and this is actually, some of this is going to be in the MLA report too, accreditation is like peer review. Actually, Donna's on an accrediting team right now, that they kind of, I'm in 18th century. I remember when I was at Florida State, Patricia Myers-Bax came in, was in the accrediting team. They just like approach, other professors, and there are people, of course, who work there for a living, but it's a peer review process, okay? It's not Arnie Duncan coming and checking out your institution. It's like when you turn in an article and a couple of other people in the field look at it. It's basically a peer review. And accrediting agencies earn their living by institutions paying them dues for this service. So Boston University pays NEASC some money, and in return, NEASC provides this service. So the current system, which is good, which a lot of people have fought really hard for to keep, is that it keeps the academic standards in the hands of academics. And that's the way it currently works. It's constantly under threat of not working that way. And that's also another motivation to get with assessment, because assessment itself was kind of a way of saying, we're going to take care of this ourselves. You don't have to come in and do this. We're going to keep it as a peer review process, which I think is really important. I think the academy would really change if that changed. So accreditation is a system for quality control. If you think it's a pain in the butt, imagine a world in which anyone can just set up, Laura's University, give me $50,000 and I'll give you a degree. So it really sort of, it's our way of keeping standards. And this has been invoked, very usefully lately with a lot of, sort of fly-by-night for-profit institutions. It's a way of, basically, it's in our interest, I think. If anyone wants to talk more about that, I'd be happy to. But I feel very strongly that it's in our interest to have accreditation and to have that as part of what we do. So in general, the assessment processes are designed locally at the institution. There's we're going to talk about in the afternoon. There's all kinds of resources to call on, but it's up to the individual institution, and they vary greatly on how much they standardize assessment throughout their programs. So I'm going to move into a slightly different topic about actually doing the measuring. So are there any questions about the kind of bigger picture about where this fits into politics and who you're working for when you're assessing?
Will you be sending us a copy of the PowerPoint?
Sure. Yeah, do that.
We'll post PowerPoint on the assessment website along with the video.
So there's two ways of figuring out whether or not students are learning, indirect measures and direct measures. Most assessment practices want at least, say you use 3 different things, you'd want at least one direct measure. So you can't use all indirect measures, but you want some, but you could use some of them. And so so a direct measure is, for example, pre and post test. I mean, that, not a lot of people in the humanities are going to do that, but a big sort of business program might do something like that. What do they know coming in? What do they know going out? What humanities people often are successful at is kind of strategic questions on exams, not the whole exam itself, but a couple of particular questions that you can sort of pull out plant there and pull out. Evaluation of student work against a rubric, that you collect, collect a bunch of papers across courses at the same level, and you want to do the assessment at the most advanced level, because the point is to see how much they have learned over the course of the program. So if you collect like freshman level papers, you're not really going to get any information about your program. You're going to get information about what kind of they're able to do coming in. So you want to get them, like if you have like Capstone is a fantastic place to collect student work for assessment. And then evaluate it against a rubric. And interviews with students can actually be direct or indirect. Like if you're trying to figure out, you can have a set of questions of if they know this, then I've been successful, and you can interview them. But you can also use it for indirect measures. So, and then evaluation of student work by someone other than the instructor. So usually we consider like an assessment is done not by the instructor, because that, although there are actually ways of doing that too, that I can talk about that a little bit, that you can incorporate it actually into your grading. And some of the software, I don't know, we like Blackboard. You have Blackboard. I don't know if Blackboard has that. We just got Canvas, which is great, and it has like places where you can put in rubrics, and and so I think I don't know. You'll have to tell me if Blackboard has anything that's useful for that. So the other thing is indirect measures, and these are totally legitimate. I think what most people would say is that they're legitimate, but you can't have only indirect measures. But you probably should have some. I mean, because they're interesting. Like for example, a survey of students. Like you can just ask students, what did you learn? And they can tell you. And this is legitimate information. It's not the only information that you want to have some direct measurement, but you can learn interesting things if you ask them that. Signs of success. Maybe this is perhaps a little bit more toward the graduate end. I don't know. Is anybody here interested? I'm curious for graduate programs. Okay. All right. Oh my goodness. All right. So graduate programs are I just like put it on the table. They're like way harder, I think, for assessment. Seriously, just because you have they're smaller, first of all, and they're highly individualized. So it's a little more challenging. But an indirect measure of the success of a graduate program can be publishing a paper, getting a job. That can be true for an undergraduate program too. Some sign of student success. That's a totally legitimate measure, but it's an indirect one. Evidence of student engagement or interest. There's a standardized test that your students can take. NSSE, National Survey of Student Engagement. Do you do that here? Oh.
We are in the middle of doing that right now.
Okay. All right. So that's actually like a really well-designed survey thing, and they'll ask students things like, how often did you come to office hours? Okay, so that's not a direct measure of learning, right? Like you can go to office hours without learning anything, right? But most people in the field think that if there are that usually engagement is a major factor in learning. So in some ways it's easier to measure engagement. So if you measure engagement, that points to learning. So do you see the difference? I mean, it's not like a direct measure of learning, but it's good information. And NSSE is a really interesting survey. And student self-reporting, I sort of mentioned that a little bit. Student achievement in subsequent classes, how they, if you have like for example, a freshman writing class, how do they do in their writing in further classes? Has that freshman writing program been effective or not, as you can see later in their other classes? And then, continued interest in the topic, which you can do in surveys. I mean, like at the University of Maryland, we've actually, for assessment in the English department, we've always had an exit survey for our undergraduates, and they think they need to take it to graduate, which actually they don't, but we do nothing to dispel this rumor because it gets them to take the survey. And so they take the survey, and we've added things for the purpose of assessment, such as, did you go to a play this year? Did you read a novel that wasn't assigned to you? So these are, this is interesting information. It would be great if you could do it like a couple of years out. Right now that's like, pretty difficult to get a hold of them after they leave. But they're completely legitimate things.
Can I add a footnote to that? On the point about student achievement in subsequent classes, which I agree is definitely a measure, sort of how things have worked out. I was actually in the position of Teagle, the foundation that I worked at, funded an institution for assessment of writing. And I'm not going to get this quite right, but the basic point was that students had intensive writing instruction in their freshman or sophomore year, seemed to do very well. That was great. What they noticed was that if they didn't reinforce this with equally strong writing instruction in subsequent years, the skill dropped off. And it did not mean that they had not done well in the first year and that the instruction hadn't been effective. It meant that the art of writing takes practice. And that you not only needed to assess at multiple points, but that when you did assess at multiple points, what you learned was that you needed to keep teaching this skill. So they couldn't just take care of it in their first year and be done and be great writers for the rest of their college career. And it significantly changed how they were offering that piece of their curriculum. They just realized that everyone needed to take more responsibility for it, and they needed to distribute teaching of that skill through the whole college curriculum if they really wanted to graduate people who could consistently write well. So, there are lots of ways to use data, and when you get data that says, oh, something has fallen off, it doesn't necessarily mean that Laura didn't teach a great freshman writing class. It means that someone else needed to teach a great junior level writing class. So.
Okay.
Sure. Oh, sorry.
Just put that
this
in
is
the
going to be
audience,
hopeless.
it's
Yeah,
not going to record.
This is going to be really difficult. If you, you guys should pass it around as you speak.
I just wanted to know: does that mean that that can be a part of an evaluation for humanities, since we do generally reinforce writing skills in a way that other disciplines may not?
I think so. And I think if you're thinking as a department, but also maybe as a program or set of departments, it's possible for you to map out where students get this skill. So not everyone needs to teach it all the time. But this is where the kind of team vision of academic work comes into play. If you're aware of what's happening across your school or across a set of departments, then you can make sure that students are sort of getting that instruction at key points in their career. And the Association of American Colleges and Universities pays a lot of attention to that kind of mapping exercise. So if you're doing a retreat at the end of the year, a group of departments or a school can sit and say, okay, so our freshmen get this and our seniors get this. No one's talking about this in the middle. Are we sure that we're reinforcing that or developing that set of skills? It's an ideal way to do it. And I think humanities departments are really well positioned to do that.
But I think, I agree with that. I think also, like, part of what I hear you saying is that, we need to find ways to, identify our contribution to the to institutions, and that is really important because that's where most of the writing instruction, I think, in most institutions takes place, and that's something everybody wants as an outcome. Yeah. And so I think you're right, and I think that's sort of another part of my shtick here is that I think kind of ultimately this is good for us. It sort of feels like most alien in a way to humanities, but it also can be useful for us in advocating for ourselves in exactly the way that you're talking about. Okay, so any other questions about indirect measures or direct measures? Oh,
Donna, can you
microphone.
Can you say something about indirect and direct measures in the arts?
I can't.
Okay, so the question was about indirect and direct measures in the arts. Okay, as opposed to the humanities. Well, I think like one sort of great direct measure in the arts is, I'll take another Maryland example in our studio art program. At the end of the year, They have, now the word is escaping me, like a gallery. What do you call that when you display?
An exhibit?
An exhibit. There you go. Thank you, English professor. So they have an exhibition at the end, and all of the faculty members, so the students do a final project for this exhibition, and all of the faculty members, it's open, everyone comes and looks at it, but the faculty members get a rubric, and they go through, and they each evaluate every single piece of it. So that's totally a direct measure. And something like they were really flummoxed for years because, how do you measure art? How do you say if there's good art and bad art? But in fact, we do it all the time, and they do it in their program all the time. And this is a way of faculty members kind of, just directly looking at objects of students that were not their students and, rating them on certain aspects, like I think, creativity, structure, skill. They actually have a rubric on that. So there are ways to do direct measures of creative arts as well as humanities.
And can I just also say on indirect measures for arts, I will ask Beth, are you participating in SNAP? I know too many of these acronyms, but are you? Maybe not.
I'm probably not.
Okay. Music does, okay. Do you want to talk about it? SNAP is the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. Okay, Emerson is doing it too, but SNAP was designed in part by George Koo and other people who designed the National Survey of Student Engagement. It's the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. It's a major national survey of arts graduates. Emerson participated for the first time this year. This is a series of indirect measures, really, of how we do in educating art students. And one of the things people wanted to know is, do people use their arts training? Do they get jobs with their arts training? What is their happiness in life? Goes on and on and on. The results are better than I think anyone anticipated. People do get jobs. They often use their arts training. They're not always working directly in their fields, but they're using their training in a variety of ways. One incredibly interesting one incredibly interesting data point really coming out of SNAP is that arts graduates want training in business. And I think most people are going out to be entrepreneurs of their own careers. And they have to know how to manage them, how to sort of handle the business side. That's a pretty consistent finding. We're hearing it at Emerson from our own students even before they take the survey. So those kinds of measures of success and looking at where your programs are serving your students well and where there are things you might or might not want to do. The data don't tell you what to do. They just give you information. But they're very, very valuable. So SNAP is the one major sort of indirect piece that I always think of with arts education.
Okay. So we can come back to any questions about that. So this slide is just to give you another big picture thing that I think you should know, because your assessment process is going to take you into conversations with other disciplines in your university, and so there's probably some kind of committee at the higher level where there's representatives, is this right, Beth, of someone from every college, and you're a university, so I don't know quite all what you have, but like a education school and lots of things that are not arts and humanities, and you end up being in conversations with these people. And this is something that's really interesting, because one thing, and I do this at Maryland, I'm on this committee with people from across many disciplines, and so one thing that you should know as you move into this world is that professional schools have been doing assessment for years, and so, which was a surprise to me, and that's because their professional organizations accredit them. So the School of Education has to be accredited by, who is it?
I don't know.
Their professional organization. Engineers have to be accredited by something called ABET. So they answer it. So of course, the idea of MLA accrediting English departments is kind of absurd, but that is actually how other disciplines work. Is that they say these are the things that engineers have to know. We're not going to accredit you if we don't think that your students are learning this. So when you walk into these when you start circulating among your colleagues in other disciplines, you will find that they've been doing this for many, many years. And so this is another reason for the confusion in the arts and humanities is, and actually I will add sciences too, because liberal arts include science and math. And that I find, so this is just my experience, but I find the division in assessment is most sort of productively drawn between professional schools and liberal arts areas. And so I have found, and other people have different experiences, but I have found a lot in common with chemistry and biology. You know, the sciences are not alien in this because they too have not had to answer to accrediting organizations before. The places that have this down already are like education, engineering, business, anymore, nursing.
Dentistry.
Absolutely, yeah.
Attorneys.
Yeah.
The arts. I mean, we're all accredited, and we do this cradle to grave. Part of what we do all day, every day.
Right, but your program like directly approved by your professional organization?
We're all accredited as schools, sure.
Right, but it's not a professional organization, it's an independent accrediting organization.
It's true, it is.
Run by peers, but it's not the actual professional organization.
Yeah.
Okay.
The National Association of Schools of Music. for
Yeah,
example, NASM
they do,
does
yeah.
the accreditation.
Okay.
They do.
And actually, I know theater departments have something like that as well. And so different disciplines have different histories of being able to do this. So, you know, one thing is like you can learn from professional schools that have already been doing this, and I've learned a lot from watching how they operate, watching how they set up assessment processes. But I think the other concern is that we want to retain the integrity of the humanities, and I do think that. I mean, everyone thinks that their assessment is the hardest, but I think ours is, because I think there are certain things that we want to get at that are challenging to assess. And so I think, that's sort of a lot of the work that Donna and I have done is thinking about, can we assess like the real things, the things that we really care about, instead of assessing kind of peripheral things that are just sort of will get us through the process. So I guess that's the last point, that learning goals might be harder to measure. I think they are. I don't know. I mean, maybe my colleagues would disagree, but I think they're harder to measure, but yet more interesting. So, like our disciplines themselves. So what are these challenges? A big one is ineffability. And this is like, so I remember when assessment sort of first came down the pike in English departments, and everybody just kind of threw up their hands, like, I don't know what it's magic. They come in thinking one way, they go out thinking another way. I don't know. What did they learn? I don't know. They learned. It's obvious. It is obvious, but we have sort of it's harder for us to say, I think. So the learning goals feel mysterious and harder to define. A goal of a course can be unclear. A learning goal of a course, like we're used to, I mean, at least I'll talk about English. I don't know if this is true for other disciplines. Of course, we tend to have either a topical or coverage model in English. Like my course this semester is Restoration and 18th Century Drama. So, there's no learning goal inherent in that. It's just that it's a content area that students come and explore with me. So, personally, what I found to be really interesting about this in terms of my discipline is sort of delving into this and finding that in a lot of the humanities disciplines, there's disagreement about what students are learning and what students should be learning. And so I think one of the things that I find actually sort of both frustrating and invigorating about assessment is that I think it starts you off on a journey to the heart of your discipline. it forces you to try to figure out what your discipline is about. And Donna and I have been doing this like for years. This is what we talk about all the time. And I don't think we like really have it yet. But you know, if you go to MLA and have a room of 20 people, everyone will say something a little bit different. But there's got to be something that ties us together. And the reason I think this is urgent is because we're under fire, and we need to explain ourselves to other people, and we need to do it in a persuasive and coherent way. And I think, I think assessment is, I think of Samuel Johnson saying, the prospect of hanging sharpens your mind wonderfully. I kind of think, we don't really know what's at the heart of our discipline because we've never had to say it, And then when somebody says to you, okay, write the outcome goals for your program, it actually kind of sharpens you. And it makes you think about these things and in ways that are really interesting, I think, and good for us, and not peripheral to what we do as teachers and scholars. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of what we've been working on with the MLA ADE committee. ADE stands for Association of Departments of English, and it's a subset within MLA. And we're doing this report on outcomes assessment. And so one thing we have found, and you'll see this report eventually, but one thing that we found useful in thinking about this report is, oops, wrong slide. Okay, is what are the myths about assessment? What do people misunderstand about assessment? And so one I've already talked about is who the accreditors are and what their relationship to us is. The other is it's the same thing as grading. I have a slide for that later. Requires specialized expertise. No, you could just do it yourself. It's not, it's not. I mean, the word for it that social scientists have is action research. It's not like you're publishing an article about how much your students learn. You're trying to figure out where there are things that you want them to learn that they're not learning, and then you take action in regard to it. So it's not sort of research the way social scientists do it. It's finding out information the way you want to find it out. And you can do it yourself. And then the other myth is that no one will care about the results of the process, and I think that's just not true. I think you will care about them. You'll be really interested. It'll be interesting to see what you find. Your colleagues will care. Your administrators will care. It's an important project. There are, however, we will admit, some genuine concerns about assessment that you need to talk about as well, that we all need to talk about. And one is that it is time-consuming. There's kind of no way around that. It's more work. It's work that you didn't have before, and now you have it. And so, there are a couple of answers to that. One is finding ways to integrate assessment into existing workflow and educational process. Like I talked about the other thing before, like having a strategic question on an exam of something that you can just sort of pull out of exams. So if you can integrate it into classes, that's the best thing. Don't create new artifacts. You don't have to give students a standardized test. You can, just gather their papers electronically. If you have e-portfolios, those are great because then you have like all the information right there. But you use the work that students have already done. You don't create like additional artificial situations, which tend not to really give you great information anyway, and are expensive and time-consuming, and students don't want to do them. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, just one thought. I agree completely. Don't make any more work than you have to. But the other thing to remember is that you have institutional research offices. You are administering, as a university, these standardized tests like at this very moment. It can be really interesting to just stop by IR and say, so what did NSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement, tell us about academic rigor? How many hours are our students spend reading a week? And just think about that in relation to what your own assessment is telling you about your own students. I mean, that's a way to kind of get into a really big national conversation, figure out where your students sit, what's interesting to you about that. But the work is already done. And most of those national surveys tend to produce results that sit on the shelves of IR offices. And that's one of the travesties, that everybody says, well, we're doing tons of assessment. It's not being used. And if that can get kind of pulled out of the shadows and put alongside the work you're doing in your classroom, you've got a really rich conversation and set of information to work from about what you then want to do as a classroom teacher, as a department, as a program. And it's not extra work. It's just talking to your colleagues, really. So that was the footnote.
Yeah, I mean, I always think, I mean, when you take this back to your department, it's like a lot of people don't want, you know, they'll say, you know, they don't want to do assessment, but then you're in the coffee room and the water cooler, and they're like, you know, students can't write, you know, they can't read Shakespeare, and, you know, so the thing is to kind of capture those objections and say, well, maybe we should be doing something about that instead of just complaining, you know, or in addition to complaining, which is like very important, I think, to, you know, so you want to draw on that. Okay, so institution assessment work will meet with insufficient institutional reward, which, you know, so you have to advocate for your work in that respect. You have to, you know, one idea I've heard is some people have assessment count under teaching rather than under service. I actually think that's an important move. I think it should be part of your teaching function, not your service function. And so that would be something to think about, and continue to raise issues of its value with administrators. But that is something that you do have to advocate for. Okay, any questions? Okay, let's go on. So here's a little piece of information from NSSE, National Survey of Student Engagement, which is that test that I talked about before. And they did a special, I don't know what you call it when they pull out the specific humanities data for us.
It's a report.
Yeah, they did a report for us for a previous conference about how humanities people were responding to assessment. So this was just arts and humanities people.
Faculty.
Faculty, yeah, faculty. So 75% indicate that their institution is involved quite a bit or very much. They're less sure that the results are being disseminated effectively. And they're sort of split about whether the efforts are useful to them. So, you know, but still, I mean, 56% think that they are useful. So, and this was actually like 3 years ago, right?
Yeah, 2 or 3.
So assessment is one of those things that's changing very quickly. So I wonder if it's different now, if there'd be, I don't know. It changes very quickly. Okay, so what do we know about assessment that is already going on in humanities department? Well, so in 2010, I teamed up with David Lawrence, who's director of research at MLA, and we did a survey in preparation for an Association of English Department workshop to train people to be chairs. And this survey was taken by chairs. We had 50 respondents, and when you get the slide, you'll see there'll be a link to the full survey. But I just thought this would be interesting to you to see what, I mean, this is 4 years old already, but to see what other people are doing about assessment, how much it has taken root in programs. And I think probably the numbers will be different now, but still, even in 2010, these are a few results that I thought you would find interesting. 86% are doing assessment for bachelor's. The graduate programs are kind of coming in this next wave. You know, it was really first undergraduate programs, and graduate programs have to do assessment too, and that's been kind of slower to get started just because it poses really different challenges, and they're real. And so they've only, 13% for doctoral programs at that point. So what did they use? Collegiate learning assessment. Do you know about this? CLA. It's okay. So this is another standardized test that you can give. It's supposed to measure critical thinking. Some people think it does. Some people think it doesn't. You know, it's much better. It's much better than a multiple choice kind of test, but it's still kind of, you know, it's still a standardized test. So this is something that some people use for assessment. What 60% of people do is they review assignments for a paper, you know, in a committee. That's what most of the programs at Maryland do, is that they, you know, go over assignments.
Yeah, can we pause on this for just a moment? Would you mind if I said something about CLA?
Sure, go ahead.
The Collegiate Learning Assessment, has anyone heard of it? Have you used it? Okay. I was just curious. It's a really interesting test. It is. I want to say it's problem-based learning. There are two parts to it. You can take one, you can take both. But students are basically in one part given a set of primary documents and asked to sort of analyze them and make a case. So the case that they have released for people to study, because they don't want people just using these offline and then going in and acing the test, has to do with whether or not you should buy an airplane, as I recall. And you're given various sort of data sets. This about the plane, the newspaper report saying the plane just crashed, a variety of things. You need to decide whether you're going to buy it, why, and what's the sort of critical thought process that leads you to that. It's really very, very sophisticated. There's another piece of the test that asks you to kind of analyze arguments and sort of decide whether they hold up or not. One piece is machine graded, one piece is humanly graded. It gets at a lot of outcomes that cut across disciplines. For departments to use it would be very difficult. It's expensive to administer. That's one of its biggest drawbacks. And it takes time. It takes 2 or 3 hours, and it's kind of outside of class time. So it's quite the opposite of being embedded in your work. As a response to kind of faculty feedback about that test, Mark Chun, who is now working at a foundation in California, but was with the group that developed CLA for a long time, developed something called CLA in the Classroom, which is, he works with groups of faculty and still does this kind of freelance to develop problem-based learning sets that help you kind of integrate this mode of teaching in your classroom if you want to be doing this kind of teaching and learning. So if you decide that what your students should know at the end of a class is they should be able to demonstrate a capacity for complex critical thought that manifests itself in real-world problem solving, essentially. He will come and work with a group of faculty to help you to develop a set of materials that would teach toward that outcome. And so it's a way of saying, well, this is what it's a backwards design process for your class. If this is what you should be able to do, you should be able to go out into the world and use all your humanities skills, all your skills as an artist, to sort of represent, visualize, critically analyze, and solve a problem. You can put together a sort of set of materials that let you teach to that. But I think, especially 2 or 3 years ago, this was so far away from anything we were doing in humanities classrooms that it just makes complete sense that people wouldn't use it. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's all those things. It is very powerful. The much simpler, sort of more cost-effective ways to do what the second line is there. So that's my footnote on that. But there is sort of interesting work going on. It's around project-based humanities work, essentially, for our disciplines. So,
and even looking at the survey, I think these two like kind of go together. Like you do
yeah.
both. Like this isn't an either or. So you have assignments and you develop a rubric, and then you get the papers and you look at the rubric. And we're going to show you some rubrics later on this afternoon for developing this. So then we asked them, do you think that outcomes assessment has the potential to improve learning in your programs, and who's been, and they said, and 89% said yes, and then who has led the effort is often the chair or the undergraduate director. So that's sort of 4 years old, 50 people. So it's not everyone, but it's kind of interesting. And what have you found most helpful? Workshop, administrators, conference, maybe not so much. Conferences don't seem to be useful, but just talking to people and then finding stuff online that, how to. There's all kinds of manuals. I mean, both of us are big fans of Peggy Mackey. She's kind of has some really great sort of, and Barbara Wolford.
Yeah.
Both of them have just really great sort of like how to do this. Okay, so now I'm going to return to this question of grading versus assessment, which is probably the hardest thing. And let me just ask if you feel like you and people in your program are still struggling with this. Yes? Yeah. Okay. So here's the difference. Okay? So a grade for a course is a composite. A grade is actually not a measure of learning. It's a composite of many different activities. Like, is your paper late? You get a lower grade for your paper being late, okay? So we use grading for, like, behavior modification that has nothing to do with actually learning. You know, it doesn't have to do with how much they understand, you know, the way of the world, how much they understand Congreve, but, you know, it's an important thing to get your stuff in on time. So we, you know, and it's important for us because we have other stuff going on. So we count that in a grade. So probably the quickest way to persuade people that they're different things is just to ask them, if you looked at all the grades in your program, do you think that the teacher who gives the highest grades is the one with the most student learning? How many people are going to say yes to that? Nobody. So they instinctively know that they're different things. This is a way of like falling back on things that people already know. They're very different things, but but often people, when they first hear about assessment, will say, "Oh, but we already do that. We grade." But in fact, grades are not evidence, or even really sort of like pure evaluation of learning, not necessarily measures of learning, and of course, they're not consistent across faculty members. Thus, the question of, you know, is the teacher who gives the highest grades the one who is generating the most learning in class? So assessment is different because it tries to capture how much students have actually learned. All right, so I mean, it's really hard, but that's what it tries to do. That's what we try to do with assessment. And assessment is generally done at the level of the program rather than the institution or the individual class. Now, having said that, there have been lots of really interesting assessment sort of research experiments in big classes. You know, you have half the class do an extra homework thing online and the other half not. You know, but these tend to be for people thinking about how can I get more of my students to learn this material. And they tend to be around big lecture classes. So you can do assessments in an individual class. However, they're really the information, the institutional information that you really want to get at is the program, because it's a cumulative student learning program rather than the individual class, and it can be embedded into a class. But they're actually, so they're really different things. There are a few instances in which grades can be used for assessment. In a few cases, they can be sort of one measure. And I'll give you an example. In the School of Education, they'll have their education outcomes, and then they'll have a content area, for example. So say the content area is history. You can look and see if the person's getting A's and B's in history, and instead of directly giving them a test on how much history they know, you can say, well, probably if they're consistently getting A's and B's in history, we can, you know, check them off for the content knowledge. Or we're achieving the content knowledge we want if most of our students who want to be history teachers are getting A's and B's in history. So that's one place where grades can actually be in information. But notice how that's like a piece of a bigger thing. So the grade is not the assessment, but there are, I'm sure there are other places too where a grade can be useful. So any questions about that or discussion? This is kind of a tough thing, but okay. So the other thing is that assessment gets confused with is teaching evaluation. You know, so that's so these are this is another sort of area of tension. But but I think they're really, really, really different things. And so teaching evaluation is individual. It's basically a survey of student satisfaction. You know, you can embed questions about reflection on learning in your evaluations, which is wonderful, but, you know, we don't always know that students self-reporting about learning is the same as whether or not they've actually learned. So they can think they're learning and not really learning. They can think they're not learning and be learning, you know, so they're not really, they're not necessarily accurate. And also, of course, I mean, I don't know, I think this is pretty obvious, and I think most people think it's pretty obvious, but I think, you know, good teaching evaluations are not necessarily correlated with high student learning. I mean, pretty much everyone in the field agrees with this. I don't think there's anybody who says otherwise. So they're different things. So you can't just say, you know, this program has great teaching evaluations, therefore students are learning. They're not related. So not in any obvious way. I'm sure there's some relationship. And of course, you know, they're often correlated with grading. Students like the course if they get a good grade. Evaluations are set up to provide information for other students, you know, shopping for courses and information about student satisfaction. And so they have their use, but they're not really an assessment of learning. And of course, you know, they've been criticized, in particular, Stephen Brint, who's in education, called it part of a consumer model of education. So I actually kind of think that this is another way in which assessment is kind of good for us, is to kind of move away from the consumer model of education, which is actually pretty bad for the humanities, and move into a learning model. So, and especially for what you brought up before about how important our outcomes in the arts and humanities are to the institution. And so I think that's going to be more powerful than saying students like our courses, we get high evaluations. So assessment is collaborative and aggregate. Student engagement can be an indirect measure of learning. The goal is to improve learning. Assessment should provide information to instructors and programs. So there are ways to, so assessment assumes that there are ways to improve learning and that improving learning is a worthy goal, which is actually not something that student evaluations assume. They're not, they're about, but of course the critique of assessment in this context is that some people think it's a slippery slope to standardization and it violates your classroom autonomy. And there are ways around that. You know, I don't know. I mean, standardization, I mean, we could talk about that. Some people think it's good. Some people think it's bad. I don't think assessment necessarily leads to standardization in terms of violating classroom autonomy. I don't know. I mean, I actually think we would benefit from more collaboration. You know, I think that autonomy is hard. I mean, I think it kind of makes it hard to do your job well. And I think that we would do better if we were more collaborative and didn't really think of it as thought of our classes as more integrated with each other for student learning rather than an expression of individuality, although they're that too, and we don't want to lose that. So, I mean, I certainly don't want to lose that.
Can we go back to that for 1 second? Oh, did you?
I just want to ask a question. I find this very interesting. If evaluation is basically a corruption of what's at stake in assessment, what's the justification for keeping it?
Anyone?
I can.
I mean, I guess, like, you know, okay.
I'm not sure we should. I actually think that's where higher ed is cracking that open. If you really think that there are outcomes you can identify that you want students to have, and if you can demonstrate that they have them, you do have to ask some questions about the rest of our apparatus. And I mean, I think partly what we're seeing is a real sea change in the structure of higher education. I mean, as we think about these things, increasingly you have to ask questions. Why give grades? And there may be good reasons to do it, but you still have to say, why give grades if what you're looking to demonstrate is competencies, in the new jargon, or a student's ability to do something? And that leads to questions. I mean, yes, it can lead to a defense of our existence. It can also lead people to say, as they're now saying, let's unbundle higher education. If what you want is this, you can get that over here, and you can get this over here. So these are sort of moving out into highly politicized discussions, but I think they're discussions we have to have.
I can imagine a student rebellion.
Yeah, but I think we need not to shy away from this. I think ultimately, Laura's right, that this takes us to the heart of what we do and to real sort of solid questions about our mission, and that's part of the value of the work. But we need to invest ourselves in this. If we do not bring all of our training and knowledge and care to the conversation, other people are going to take it over for us, and they won't necessarily be people who are coming from the same place we are. I mean, there is a progressive angle here, right? This is the sort of tradition of thinking about learning and how does it happen that has fueled this discussion for about 20 years, and those people never got any traction. And then the government came in and said, well, we might want to sort of have some standardized measures, and everybody got really upset, and all of a sudden all the learning people are center stage because they know something that we need to know. And so I think the question is really valid, and I think the answer is not obvious. And I do have one last thought on standardization, which is that when I started in this work sort of 8 or 9 years ago, I think I too thought, yeah, the risk of sort of setting up outcomes is that we're all going to have to do the same thing. I now think exactly the opposite. I think that if we know what outcomes we want to have, we want to be able to demonstrate that students are creative. What does that mean? We can break that down. We want to be able to demonstrate that you can think critically. What does that mean? We can break that down. Then, from the time you get them to the time they leave 4 years later, if that's the model, you could theoretically have a blank slate. You could be as innovative and imaginative as you want to be. There is no particular reason, except management convenience, for us to be marching people through degrees the way we do. Now, understand, and I'll talk about this afternoon, that we live in the real world. We don't have the luxury of just ripping everything apart and saying, oh, we're going to do it an entirely new way next year. All the old rules are out. Nonetheless, in theory, that's a thought experiment you could play. That would be a sort of exercise, a planning exercise on campus. If you did not have this structure, but you wanted these outcomes that we've agreed on, what would you build to get there? And that probably wouldn't lead to you tossing out your whole curriculum because we just couldn't survive it. But it might lead to some interesting changes or some interesting experiments. I mean, I think that's the money question. It's a really huge one.
I guess I also think, to add to that, I think if we stopped doing student evaluations, the students would not rebel, because I think the institutional student evaluations that we do, they've already moved away from them. They have their own sites, and they have their own sort of like secret shopping sites about courses where they share information about the things that they want to know, like how many papers, how hard do they grade, do they care if you're late, and so they have their own system that's they're incredibly networked, which I would have no way of knowing except for I have a daughter in college now, and she's like telling me about, and I think all institutions have them, like the shadow evaluations. So I think they just don't pay attention to ours anymore. And actually, my evidence for that is that, I mean, at my institution, they're now online, and like 15%, 20% of them will actually do them. Like, they don't care. They're not invested in that system. They're invested in the shopping system, where they get the key information. And there's all kinds of other websites where you get information about institutions that are student-run. So
presumably administrators for the key evaluations at this point. Maybe soon they won't after today.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. You can speak to this. Most administrators I've heard talk about these, actually, two things happen. I've seen them be looked at a great deal, even though everybody seems to know that they're deeply flawed. And so, yeah. Ideally, this is where institutions start asking people to put together teaching dossiers and other things. And it does, again, you're increasing work, and I think a good sort of set of assessment practices might lessen the burden on faculty to put together particular kinds of portfolios to counteract overly reductive evaluations.
So I think, in certain ways, assessment can help us renew our teaching by thinking about, instead of thinking, okay, I'm teaching restoration drama, what 8 plays am I going to teach this year? And that's been always my focus in teaching, has been content, which I agonize over and probably doesn't really matter that much to the students because it isn't really related to their learning, but it seems monumental to me. So in the traditional model, we lecture, okay, I've been talking to you, but you're advanced listeners, so you're able to get this. Emphasis on product rather than process, transfer of information. A lot of people will just say, well, the students are responsible for success or failure. I always think about the model of feeding the cats. I just give them the food. I just put it out there. They can come by and eat it or not. And so I think that's kind of the model of teaching that we've sort of often developed. And we learn by just watching previous teachers. Okay, so a student-centered model is more collaborative. We have students do research. We have them writing in drafts, oral presentation, strategies for engagement, more discussion-oriented. Sometimes digital tools can help. Sometimes they don't, but you can figure that out. You can draw on research based on how people actually learn and what gets them to learn, and I guess my model is really shared responsibility for student learning. I'm not saying it's all on me, but it's a team effort between me and them. So sometimes, of course, students just don't cooperate at all, and there's nothing you can do about that. It's not all on you, but it's a shared effort between you and the student. You're not just putting things out. So this is a whole other issue, and I'm just going to mention this, and if anyone wants to talk about it later, you can. But a lot of courses are moving to for online and blended models, and I just want to point out that one of the big Achilles heels of online learning has been the learning outcomes. And I also think that this kind of goes with the discussion of accreditation and how, we can use accreditation to fight against the rise of for-profit institutions. You can also sort of use assessment to evaluate online learning, and that's kind of how a lot of these MOOCs have just been, the MOOC thing is kind of crashing and burning because it's being discovered that they don't actually learn. And so, if you keep learning front and center, we're going to develop things that are good and have the right priorities. And so that's always the question to ask if you have a robust assessment community to say about, moving to an online model. Well, do students learn? Does it work? So I think that's just been a crucial part of the online thing and some, ways of thinking about it in positive and negative ways. So here's something that I think is really important because you're a university and you also train graduate students. And because assessment has become really widespread, I think we have to train our graduate students for answering interview questions a little bit differently, especially when they go to small colleges. They're used to being in a research environment, and often most of the jobs are in teaching-intensive institutions that they're going to interview at. And so I think, I actually had the experience of a graduate student who said, so this was by correspondence, and they said, I'm supposed to tell them how I know my students are learning. So what should I do? I was thinking of sending them my teaching philosophy. Like, That's not what they're asking. So our students need to be hearing that question for what it is. And so because this new generation is entering a world in which the questions are not about what's your teaching philosophy, but how do you know your students are learning, graduate students really need to know this more than anyone else. And I've been teaching this winter term course at Maryland for graduate students on outcomes assessment. And they actually, they love it. It's really a fun course. And you might want to think about something like that, of a way of preparing your graduate students for the job market, because in the kind of final stages, you know, it's not going to get them the job, but it's going to make a difference as more and more people are doing this. So they'll get questions like, how do you engage students? What opportunities do you set up for student inquiry? How do you manage group work? You know, all these kind of things that are more about this sea change that Donna was talking about, in the way that a lot of institutions are talking about teaching and learning, that I think were not the way, at least I was raised into the profession. So they're very different. So you have to train students for those questions in ways that are different from the way you answered them when you got your job, because the landscape has really changed. Okay, so here's coming to the end of this. There'll be little time for discussion before lunch, but we're coming to the end of the presentation. Just a few tips for implementation. Be patient and listen. Find allies in the department. Hold a workshop. You're doing that today. Hold them in your program. Avoid excessive jargon. I know people who will not even use the A word. They, talk about student learning, and somehow assessment is going to turn people off. I personally feel like it's really important to explain the bigger picture, because I think that's the thing that's the most misunderstood. And maybe we're moving away from that as people come to understand it a little better. But I think the issue of what accreditors are and what they want to see, I think, is really widely misunderstood. That's been my experience, and I do a lot of this sort of going to schools and talking about assessment, and I do it at my own institution. So I hear a lot of what people talk about, and I think that's the most important thing. And tap into faculty priorities, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Like, how is this good for you? Like, how does this benefit for you? And of course, funding. There are grants out there to get for assessment projects. So you might think about that. Teagle did a lot. I don't know who the Spencer Teagle Foundation grants. Talk to your grant officers. So there is some funding out there. So here are the benefits for you. I think you'll learn a lot about your students once you start doing this. Some things will surprise you. It can help you clarify the goals of your program, which is really useful. I have some of my colleagues in my department. I didn't think of this, and they just do this on their own. And I need to start doing this. They actually put the program outcomes on their syllabus. It's like, I'm not a freak for wanting you to write well. This is actually a program goal. It's not, students think of things very individually, but they just stick the program goals right on their syllabus. And that kind of, is very powerful. Personally, I think it's made grading a lot easier since I've learned more about assessment. I think grading is usually the thing that faculty dislike the most about their jobs. I think once you think about assessment in terms of, okay, so the reason I think faculty agonize over grading. I think they agonize over it needlessly. And my personal theory about why we, in the humanities in particular, agonize about grading is that we're not exactly sure what the goal is. And we're not exactly sure what constitutes an A or a B or a C paper. And so the way to avoid that agonizing is to set it out in advance. If you have a rubric, or, I mean, one thing I've done is now I work in drafts. I never did that before, but students always turn in a draft. First they turn in a draft. I only give comments on the draft. I tell them, this is what you need to do to make this an A paper. They turn it back. Grading takes 5 minutes. Either they've done it or they haven't. You know, to the extent, and, you know, and because you all know that reading a paper and giving it an evaluation is a snap. If that's all you had to do, you would be done in an hour for the whole class. But the thing that's hard is explaining to them, you know, well, this part is good and that part's not good, and, you know, and that is like incredibly time-consuming and agonizing and labor-intensive. And I think if you think about outcomes and set out the outcomes at the beginning in a really clear way, in collaboration with other people, it helps your grading go faster. I mean, I found that. It promotes collaboration, which makes your teaching easier also if you can talk to other people about how they're doing it. It can inspire new teaching strategies, and it even streamline class preparation, I found. You know, if you think about, you know, I used to think about, have I read like every single article on Congreve, you know, before I walk into this class so that I could answer any possible question that comes up. You know, okay, like they're juniors. They haven't read any articles on Congreve. You know, I mean, the real question is, like, what do I want them to see in the play? And so that is actually like kind of easier, actually. I mean, it's sort of, it's more fun. And that sort of brings them into the process a lot more actively, and they're talking to me more, and I'm listening to them more in this model. So yeah, this is the last point, that I'm turning a little more responsibility over to the students for their learning. You know, that they need to talk back to me, and actually that, you know, internet can be great for this. I have them write on a blog in advance of class what they're, you know, on certain topics about the play, even before we talk about it, you know, and so that's just really helpful. So I know where they're at, so that I'm focused on, like, teaching students, not teaching Congreve. So, yeah, two questions? No, okay. Okay. All right. So, general advice for you to offer your programs: develop rubrics. Do not reinvent the wheel. There's plenty of resources out there. You don't have to think about this from the ground up. You know, make it collaborative. Expect to modify just like anything else. Integrate it as much as you possibly can into work that you already do. Put some resources into it. You can do this within departments. You know, what it counts as in your work. Don't, like, add it on. You know, have it count for something. You can involve students. And okay, so this is a really important one. Ask only things that you really want to know. Yeah. Right? And then you'll be interested in the answer, and you won't be wasting your time. And so okay. And then finally, I think we all need to rewrite our narratives about assessment, and you need to write your own. And this is the, you know, humanities advocacy part. So if you think your subject is valuable, then what you want is for other people to learn it. So that's, like, sounds really simple, but if you ask the question, you know, why do we care? It's because what we do is valuable. I think, therefore, assessment is ultimately a progressive project, especially in the arts and humanities, rather than a conservative one. Hierarchy thrives on people not knowing what we know. We want more and more people to know what we know. We want as many people as possible to know this. And so it's in our interest to figure out whether or not they're actually getting it. So we can think about how great it would be if people really got it. That would be really cool. And of course, some of your students will go on to become educators themselves, so they'll be spreading the word out there. Arts and humanities are crucial. We want as many people as possible to understand them. Today's students are tomorrow's readers, arts donors, audiences, museum goers, creators, voters, and citizens. Often when I go to MLA, people are always talking about, outreach, outreach, outreach. How can we reach the public? Okay, I say in reach. They're right in front of you, people. And notice how little we talk about teaching and about whether or not students are learning. People think of outreach as non-academic things. I don't know, having a website about Congreve that anyone can go look at. Well, sure, that would be nice. But really, we have a lot of power right in front of us to advocate for our importance. And these are people who are only going to be students for a few years. They grow up, they vote, they make decisions. They're important. So that's our first sort of line of advocacy. So we have some time for questions. I'm just going to open it up for discussion.
Yeah, is one of the reasons why there aren't more measures for graduate programs because we have theses and policy papers, and dissertations, and all the things that go into those type of things that are very easy, basically more easy to assess than undergraduate programs. Is that the reason that and a lot of graduate students also engage in teaching?
Right.
Another thing to measure, or is it just something that is more difficult?
Well, I think it is more difficult. And I think the reason it's more difficult is because you have you don't have a cohort. Like you can get sort of 200 students who have taken a 400 level class, but in your program, how many PhDs do you graduate a year? So the thing to think about is that assessment is assessment of the program, not of the student. And that's even more harder to separate in graduate programs. So for graduate programs, I think, on the other hand, there are a couple of places where you could figure out where you can use as opportunities for assessment. So, for example, in the exam, you can sort of set out things in advance that you hope students know by the time they get to the exam, and make a list of them, and then after the exam is over, survey, have everybody in the room fill that out. Now, so for example, suppose they know in literature, suppose they know a lot of history, but they don't know a lot of theory. And they're not doing a theory project, so maybe it doesn't really matter for them, but you feel as a program that everybody should have that. So then if you get a consistent pattern of faculty reporting that students don't know much theory, then you look at your curriculum and you say, well, maybe we should require this course. Even for people who don't have theory-oriented projects, they should have some knowledge of it. So I guess graduate programs are really hard because they're so highly individual, and also because exactly what you said, there's benchmarks. And a lot of graduate programs confuse benchmarks with assessment. And a lot of graduate programs think that the benchmarks are the assessment. And the difference is the benchmarks are things that students need to reach, and the assessment is the way you change your program. And I think, it gets even harder when you get out of coursework because students are working with individual faculty members. So how do you assess a program without it reflecting on the faculty member? But I think one thing that you mentioned is if you're training them to be teachers, I think that's a great thing to assess. You can assess their readiness to be teachers. Like that's a good thing to assess. And then you can assess at the exam, and you can also assess at the defense, because you've got a bunch of people in a room listening to a project, and you can set out in advance what you think the student should know or be able to do by then. And it would be entirely possible for the student to do great on the defense, and you think they're ready to go, they've written an excellent dissertation, but nevertheless, there might be things that you think they would have been better off having known by that point. So the assessment doesn't really reflect on the student, it reflects on the program. And so the reason graduate programs are so hard is because of the confusion with benchmarks and the individualism of graduate programs, the individual orientation of graduate programs, and also which makes, and the one-on-one relationship with the advisor, which makes it hard to say how much of this is the program or the particular advisor, and you don't really want to assess advisors. And then also just like the numbers, like if you have 2 students, what 50% is meaningless, right? As an outcome. Although there are, having said that, there are undergraduate programs that are tiny also, that only graduate 4 or 5 students a year. And so really you need to do something that's more qualitative than, you just can't do a quantitative assessment, I think, in graduate programs. I don't know, does that help at all?
Yeah, I think it's very good because I'd always thought that, the idea of the dissertation itself was a measurement. All the hoops that you have to go through. This gives it another element, which brings me to my next question. I like that slide a lot. And, I think a problem we have in education right now is we cannot project, these intangibles, which in a way are more important than, necessarily the measurements you would have with someone who graduated from dental school.
Yes.
Billing, because these things are they're trying to focus students even on being citizens. I find really, really hard.
It is hard.
There's so many things that are drawing their attention away from these types of issues.
I totally agree, and that's, I think, sort of at the heart of what Donna and I think about a lot in this context, is how can we get at that, and it has to be collaborative. It has to be something, because nobody can do it in a semester in one class. You can't get your student to think about in terms of citizenship. You have to pull together as a program and decide what we really want our students to be able to do. And I think that even though these sort of intangible things are really hard, I think because they're really hard, often the response is, or at least at first the response was always, oh, no, we can't do that, that's not for us. But I really think that we need to figure out how to do it to, continue to have our significance recognized. Do you want to add to that, Donna?
I did, but do you want to go ahead and speak first?
Hi. I just wanted to say that I think the AAC&U is doing some great work in this area. They're putting out a lot of reports that kind of show the benefits of a liberal arts education. They're doing employer educator forums across the country to kind of have employers talk about the benefits of a liberal arts education, why they seek out those who have those skills learned in the liberal arts. And I know they're doing a lot from their publicity offices as well, because I'll see their work being reported upon. So I just think that kind of work is just invaluable, and I just want to make everybody aware to maybe the AAC&U. And
you're going to get some of their rubrics this afternoon,
Oh,
because we love them also.
We love them, yeah.
American Association of Colleges and Universities.
But it's interesting how few people have even heard of them,
Yeah.
because they're probably our most effective advocacy group. I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, they had a wonderful forum in October in Boston, where they had corporate CEOs from National Grid and other corporations. They had college presidents, including Marty Meehan, and it was just really excellent day of kind of an employer-educator exchange with a focus on, again, the benefits of a liberal arts education.
General Motors could have used them.
That was a great day. Beth and I were actually both there, and it was terrific. And what I was going to say, sorry.
Oh, I just was going to say, I spoke right after Marty Meehan, but what happened was it was full when he was there, and then when I went on,
But I was
let's just say it was a little less crowded.
It was a great day, though, and I thought it was really useful. And AAC&U's crossover efforts to bridge spheres, I think, is very important. And I was just meditating on the intangibles because that's where Laura and I started talking about learning outcomes in arts and humanities. And one of the questions we asked ourselves, and we want to talk more about this in the afternoon, is, is there anything that's really intangible? And I still think there might be, but I don't think that should slow us down. And a lot of, I think, what we think of as intangible is only intangible because we've not articulated it. I mean, I am a student of my discipline, right? The divine fiat made the world. If we say it, we've got something to think about. If we say we're educating for creativity, if we say we're educating for citizenship, then we've got something to think about because we know how the work we're doing does or doesn't support that outcome. And I think for a long time we've not had to talk about these things. It was considered a self-evident good. And in a climate where that's no longer the case and where I think the kind of contract around the value of education, the social contract, is very much up for grabs, developing and circulating that vocabulary becomes a really important thing. And I think communication is a large part of the effort. Assessment is assessment. It's telling us something about how we're doing on the outcomes we've identified. But being able to talk about the process, the outcomes, the measurements, why it matters, is hugely important, not just for PR purposes, but because it actually sort of opens up our whole world and our ability to do our work well. Because what I'm really struck by is once you've made that statement, it's there, we all work with it. And if you walk into class thinking, oh, I'm educating citizens as opposed to I'm educating the next generation of professors, it's a very different goal, Yeah, that's the end of that comment.
She's coming with the microphone.
I have 3 comments or questions. I don't know if I'll get to all of them, but the first one is just to follow up on the conversation about graduate education. I think in the arts, as opposed to the humanities, the challenges to assessment are even greater because it's not just post-coursework, it's actually some of the most core coursework. At both the graduate and undergraduate levels, it actually occurs one-on-one between student and teacher. So it's not just sort of writing the dissertation, it's taking lessons, it's individual instruction, and there are very often connections between one student and one instructor through all of the undergraduate years or all the graduate years. And so it's impossible to separate the individual from the program in many cases, and it makes it that much more difficult to measure outcomes. And so in music, which is what John and I are dealing with, that's a particular challenge. So I'm hoping we can address that particular issue at some point this afternoon. That'll be very helpful to us. Second, I find myself in a funny position defending teaching evaluations, but just so we don't fully demonize them, I think, at least for us, they actually have proved useful in identifying issues and problems that we might not have otherwise found out. So that giving students, obviously, one of the things you're saying is that the assessment process, if we think it through carefully, can give students a voice that they don't have. But evaluations do actually do that. And so I think that, there are some I completely agree. The consumer orientation and the way that they are interpreted is really not the best way. But at the same time, they do actually serve a useful purpose, or they can. And then third, I'm just a little confused because there was something that seemed like a contradiction in a couple of your slides. And I know it's not really a contradiction, but it struck me that way. And it was the question of student responsibility for learning. One of your earlier slides mentioned that in general, the way I think it was in reference to grading, that it's really the student's responsibility in the classroom to learn. It's not really the instructor's responsibility, it's the student's responsibility to learn the grade. And so what we need to do is somehow move some of that responsibility onto the instructor. But then in the later slide, when you were actually talking about assessment itself, you mentioned that in this case, the assessment process done right allows students to share in the responsibility with the instructor. So at one point you were saying students have all the responsibility. In another situation you were saying they don't have the responsibility. And it would help for me if you could clarify what seems to be a contradiction, because this is actually talking very much about modifying the way that we actually present our materials and courses, and it would be very helpful to know in a little more detail what that meant.
Okay, so what I think is that in the traditional model of teaching, the learning responsibility is given to the student, and the professor's responsibility is to transfer of information, the lecture model. Whereas I think in a student-centered model, which I feel is encouraged by outcomes assessment, and an outcomes assessment model, it's a collaboration. So the student can become more active in the learning process. So it's not just a one-way street, which is not to say so that the student can be engaged in more active learning projects. So I think that would be the distinction that I would encourage us to think about, to put more of the responsibility for the learning on students, to include students in that process. Not everybody does. Like in a classic lecture model, and this is also kind of the flaw in the MOOC model, the information is presented and it's 100% up to the student, and the faculty is responsible for the information, but not for the learning. So I think assessment encourages us to move more toward a model that there's some collaboration between the student and the faculty member. Does that clarify it? Do you want to add to that?
No. No, I think active and passive learning is a slightly different distinction than responsible and not responsible, but it's a really, that is the shift that I'm aware of. I'm actually, thinking a little bit, but I think active and passive learning is the big shift over the last 30 years.
Can I ask you just to go back to that last slide?
Sorry. So I just wanted to ask about in a comment you just made. You said assessment, comparing it to you're speaking to this question of graduate assessment. That you said assessment is change, and that seems that I think that's one of the reasons people resist it. But I also know that from our own experience in the writing program, we do a lot of assessment, but probably the hardest thing to do is that last step, which is making changes based on the assessment. And I'm wondering if you're going to be talking about that at some point, or if you want to answer it in full now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the afternoon.
We do want to talk about it, but I mean, in a way, you can't talk too much about it, but it's easier to talk about than to do. No, and I mean, I've been in the interesting position of being able to seed a lot of assessment work, watch it happen. I'm now on a campus where I'm much closer to it. I'm still not the person most directly responsible for making it happen, but I am facilitating conversations around data use, okay? And I guess I really think it's hard. And we can come back to it, but it seems to me, I mean, you can tell me what your experience has been, but here I'm learning from people who have done a lot of this work nationally. You get results back. I think this is about communication, and that means not letting reports languish on shelves. That means, not sort of doing the work thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know if this looks good for us. I'm just going to, let's see if anyone asks a question, and I'm not going to talk about it. It also doesn't, and the other thing that happens, I think, is that you get back binders full of raw data or something horrifying like that, and you're like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I've got 500 data points. That's too much. I mean, it is too much. It's information overload. And so in my own experience and what I've been able to sort of work with people on is pulling out one or two pieces of information that speak to something you actually care about and creating occasions to talk about that information and to say what it means. And I think that's really important because I think, and I'll say this again this afternoon, but information is information. Data points are data points. They tell you something. It's not clear to me that they're self-evident at all. And so I know that Charlie Blage, who works at the Wabash Center of Inquiry in Liberal Arts and runs the Higher Education Data Sharing Consortium, does a lot of work with schools on data, and he'll pull out a couple data points and say, well, what do you think this means? And he always starts by talking to students. We have a data point that says, faculty aren't very available for consultation on your campus. And if you just walked into faculty and said, well, here's what it says, everybody would be very distressed. And I did watch him do this once with groups of students, and it was a really fascinating conversation, because what we heard was that faculty were actually pretty available, but students were very anxious about talking to them, because the faculty seemed very accomplished. They'd written books. Students felt like they had to do a lot of prep before they could go talk to them. And that opened up a very different conversation than it would have been if we'd kind of assumed, oh, this means faculty don't care. Not at all the case. And then you're able to, your faculty and students can have conversations. Faculty can talk to each other. Do we want to change this? Do we not? It's not clear what kind of change should happen unless you've had those conversations. So for me, that's the linchpin. All the assessment is in a way your prep work. It lets you report to the accreditors. It's going to make some people happy. But as far as being an educator goes, it's a piece of information for you to work with. And so that's why I think it's so important, Laura, what you said about asking what you really want to know about. If you've got some huge, horrifying data set, I would look at it, but I would actually go to the IR office and say, help me wade through this. How much of this is noise? How much of this is interesting? What stands out to you? Oh, okay. And go from there. And I would really create campus occasions for conversation and then say, so what do we do? And if everybody's really tired and it's like, you know what, this is important, we're going to put it in our long-range planning. We're going to think about this. We're going to put some resources for it. We don't have that available for another year. Great. This is a disaster. We have to fix it now. Great. This is just interesting. We think we could do something different. Let's see what we can do now. Great. So I guess I tend to move that way. It is really important. If you don't do that piece of the work, the rest of it, except for satisfying bodies that are worried about accountability, it's like, why bother? It's just a lot of effort that doesn't get you anywhere.
I would just add on to that our accrediting body doesn't really care about the prep work. It only cares about that last bit. About whether you've used the information you've gathered to do something, and to do something significant. So that's, I think that's a kind of external reason reinforcing what Donna and Laura have been saying, that you really need to ask the questions that you want to know about and that you care about, because otherwise you're going to get yourself into a box where you're having to do some action about something you don't really care about. So you don't even want to go there. So I think that there is, as assessment matures, there's increasing attention to what you actually do about what you've learned. And I think Donna's exactly right. Understanding what it is that you think you've learned is really important. And it takes time to figure that out. At least my experience has been that, you think you're gonna gather some information, you're gonna sit down with a group of your intelligent colleagues and take a look at this. And sometimes you realize you've gathered the wrong stuff, or that you're asking the wrong questions, and you come up with a conversation that's not quite getting you where you want to go. So you say, okay, we're going to do it slightly differently next semester or next year, to try to really make sure we get at what it is that we care about. So it's a process that takes time.
And I guess the one thing that I would add to that is that, whatever system gets set up at the institution, it has to be flexible enough to recognize that. And if it isn't, you kind of have to push back on that, which might be successful and might not be, depending. I've seen institutions where it's not successful. And what I'm thinking about in particular is that if you're going to work on something important, you're not going to have like a loop closed every single year. You're not going to be able to report, well, we got this information, we radically changed our program, and then next year you radically change your program again as a result of, and so you need to set up a process that is really much more long-term and much more kind of, reflective, and not make people feel compelled to kind of manufacture things that, just to fill out the form. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure Beth is going to be great. I've seen a lot of different processes that sometimes I think make that mistake in kind of wanting to see sort of, you know, use of results too often. And because also I think a result is just what, I mean, the thing that Beth just said, well, we tried doing it this way and it didn't work. Well, that's a result. Like, now we know. We're going to do it another way. So it's much better to go back and do it the other way rather than saying, oh, gosh, we got to have something for our dean. You know, we're going to put this down anyway, even though it was crappy. You know, I think it's much better to have a kind of open dialogue in which that very thing is really recognized. And, I mean, I'd really push for that. I've seen a lot of different institutions where sometimes that's really a flaw in what they're trying to get out of assessment. I've seen some bad ones.
I suppose this is a question about where evaluation meets assessment. I noticed that in evaluation forms, at least in our department, the default honorific is enthusiastic or enthusiasm.
Oh, that's right, isn't it?
And you know, that could just mean he or she seems to be having a good time, and that's cool. Better that than the opposite. But there is a sense in which that means something, that what we have to teach our students is above all, maybe not above all, but among other things, an attitude of creative exhilaration when confronting the text or whatever the art form. And I wonder where enthusiasm or take whatever exhilaration, whatever E word you like, because we know that the F word is ineffability. How that fits into your plans?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I think, you know, enthusiasm, evidence of enthusiasm or engagement are like great indirect measures of learning. I think that, you know, and that's why the whole NSE, you know, National Survey for Student Engagement, measures engagement, not because engagement is learning, but because engagement usually means there's some learning going on. And I think, you know, that's a perfectly acceptable, even great thing to kind of, you know, try to get at. I would say, so I guess the way to translate it into assessment would be the infectiousness of the enthusiasm. And if the students, you know, you're not really judging how the evaluation form is judging how enthusiastic the faculty member is, or it's warning other students, you know, oh, this lady is like so bored, you're not going to be very interested in her class, you know, or she loves Congreve and you will too. and so that's the evaluation part, but the assessment part would be, was the enthusiasm infectious? So are you picking, so if you can measure in students or figure out if students are coming out just like having had fun. I mean, I think that's one way in which student evaluations used strategically can be an indirect measure of learning. And I think in particular around that enthusiasm. I mean, I gave a talk once where I had this analogy between, I have friends who are fitness instructors, and they have, you know, it's this sort of nationally normed fitness program called Body Step, and they had, and Body Pump is all these body things, as if you're going to use anything else. And so, it sounds better if there's a body in it. And so one of them was like, so they record themselves through the class, and they have a rubric of how to evaluate the instructors. And my favorite one of them is called Fitness Magic. And I think that's like the thing that gets other people to finish the class and have fun and, you know, get up on the step even when you're tired and add 5 more pounds to your barbell. And, you know, so that is sort of, to me, has always been an interesting analogy that they include that in how instructors are evaluated for their ability to teach this class. So I think enthusiasm is a great measure.
Just to expand on that, I'm married to a instructor. I've seen.
All right.
I take the classes. The training materials are really impressive.
They're awesome. Yeah.
But one of the elements of this magic actually just to go into is that is the idea of teaching in multiple voices and reaching people in multiple ways. So that no one particular strategy, no matter how successful it is going to be completely effective. You've got to be able to reach different people through different ways of speaking and also reaching the same people in different ways.
I have too. It's a model. It's a model of infectiousness, of how to. Yeah. So there's another. It is actually a great program, I must say.
Except that, of course, it generates great profits.
That's funny.
Yeah, I mean, just at the risk of losing everyone else on this conversation, because I think of it as an analogy to assessment. When it first came to my gym, we were all outraged because we all had these individual instructors who did their own choreography, and they would do like new choreography all the time. And in the Les Mills system, you do one choreography for 6 weeks, and then you change, and then you can mix it up. And everyone was like, really, standardization, we hate this, we're leaving. and nobody asked us, but now everyone just loves it. Because the standardization is actually helpful, because you can go to any class, and and so you get more exercise because you're not thinking, it's just, you're not figuring it out. So I think I've always thought there's a great analogy to teaching and learning. Yep. It does. I think that's right. I totally agree. Okay. A little free ad for Les Mills.
Well, I think that's it for our morning session. Thank you, everybody. Please feel free. I know some of you have signed up for lunch. Even if you didn't, there is extra, I know. So please feel free to hang around. Things are being set up. You can bring plates back to the table. You can sit around the table in the other room. For those of you listening on the afternoon. So thank you, everybody, and stay tuned for more things to on the website.
Assessment magic.